Is life as a doctor in Switzerland really worth the hype? You might have heard that doctors in Switzerland are making a ton of money, driving Teslas to work and just living it up. Is it true? Well, it's not false. We're not here to talk about how Swiss doctors spend their money or how much they make. The question is, do they have to work less for it? Let me know in the comments down below if you'd like a video talking about the actual salary of a doctor and the rate per hour. My name's Sarah, and after graduating from King's in London, I moved to Switzerland to pursue my medical residency training. On this channel, I try to share my experiences in medicine and help as many of you along your medical journey. When I was looking into moving to Switzerland, I found very little information online. And I mean in regards to the training system, how to apply, the salary, and the working hours. There's limited information online and it varies a lot, so I couldn't get anything precise. So how many hours do Swiss doctors actually work per day and per week? If you want the quick 5-second answer, by law, they're not allowed to work more than 50 hours a week. The reality, very much different. Now, this is still very vague and I don't think it's very helpful if you're looking to move to Switzerland and you want to imagine what a typical week would look like. So let's do that together. We're going to go through 2 typical weeks, one in the medical department and another in the emergency department. These are weeks that I've actually worked through and they're very representative of what you could be expected to do. So before we tackle the typical weeks, let's talk about a standard day as a doctor in a medical department in Switzerland. So typically, and this is what happens in my current hospital and my last one as well, you will start your day at 8 a.m. and finish at 6 p.m. You get a 30 to 45 minute break halfway through the day. Shortest possible day you can have is 8 a.m. to 5:30 p.m. because 5:30 is when there's the handover to the night team. And if you finished your jobs for the day, you can just hand over and go home. The longest possible day, there are no limits. Typically, when you start a new job, you're figuring out the ropes, you're taking longer to do everything, and it's very common to finish late. I've experienced this, and I see new colleagues experience this all the time. I'm not here to encourage it, and there's definitely loads of things you can put in place to be more efficient and to finish on time. So I'm not saying you necessarily need to finish late when you start a new job, but it's just the reality of it. When you actually think about it, it's insane the amount of things you need to adapt to every time. Doctors oftentimes have to start new jobs in new hospitals, in new departments, new colleagues, and new computer systems. There's a whole range of things that you need to learn just to have to relearn a new system a couple of months later. And that is not an easy task. So it's not surprising at all to have to finish late in the first few weeks or months of your job. Another reason would be the admin. So in Switzerland, depending on the job you have and the department you work in and the hospital you're working in as well, a bunch of admin tasks are delegated to the doctor. For example, in my hospital, in the emergency department, we have to bill for each patient. So what that means is we have to fill in an extra form for every single patient, identifying what we've done. So if we've taken history, done an examination, x-rays, nasal swab, asked for a specialist's opinion, that's going to determine the cost of the management that day. These tasks can really add up, even if it just takes 2 minutes for every patient. If you see 20 patients that day, that's 40 minutes just for that specific admin task. Another reason is paperwork. One big difference I've noticed between the UK and Switzerland is in terms of the patient documentation and discharge letters. They are so much more detailed and longer in Switzerland. I'm not going to go into if that's a good thing or a bad thing. I think a balance is always the best. In the UK, at least where I worked, it was very succinct. And that meant that we could go faster and provide more care to our patients. But the downside is it's easier to miss out some important information or maybe make mistakes. The downside of the Swiss system is that it takes a lot of time. And if French or German or Italian isn't your first language and you're already struggling speaking it and writing in it, you're definitely going to be slower than the others. I remember my first discharge letters in French took ages. And for a typical resident who already speaks the language, who knows the system, their day's going to be pretty packed. So imagine someone else who has these extra challenges of starting a new job, not speaking the language extremely well. They're necessarily going to work extra hours. And then typically your day might be longer just because medicine, there's emergencies. You can't just leave exactly when your shift ends. To give you an idea, in the beginning, it was not at all surprising for me to work 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. With those 2 extra hours giving me time to finish my documentation or deal with any emergency that I had to sort out. Now, this is no longer the case and you get better with time, but it's to hammer in the points that in most places, the shortest amount is 10 hours a day for a residency training post with the possibility of extra hours being added on. Okay, so let's go through 2 typical weeks in a residency training program. I just figured out how I can record my screen and it's just to have something to write on so we can have visual representation. Okay, so typical week in medicine. So this is a standard week of shift work because I'm not going to do a standard 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. You already know what that looks like. So a typical week of shift work, we're going to do N1, N2, N3, and then day off, and then a P. Okay, so what does this mean? These are all night shifts, yeah? So you do a night shift, and this is going to be a night shift that, depending on your hospital, let's just say it starts off at 8 p.m. and it finishes at 8 a.m. Okay. Typically, the hours of your night shifts, even in the UK, they change. So let's say your second night, you're starting at 8 p.m. and you finish at 6 a.m. because there's another handover with a different team taking over the early morning. And then your next night shift is going to be 8 p.m. to 6 a.m. again. So that so far is 12 hours, 10 hours, 12 hours again, so that's 34 hours, and then you've got 2 days off. So a holiday, it's not a holiday, it's just a day off. It's your weekend in the middle of the week, so this is off. And so this we have in certain hospitals, it's called piqué. Essentially what it means is you don't need to be in the hospital, although you're on call. You have to be within 2-hour radius of the hospital, and if they don't call you in, that means you're not working that day. You get paid a lower rate and it counts as hours of work. However, it is very possible for them to call you and you have to come into work because either someone's sick or they don't have enough doctors that day or X other reason. So you're the standby doctor. So this is piqué. And let's assume that you get called in. That's another 10-hour shift, but it's a classic 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. So that's 10 hours. So that's a grand total of 32 hours. And then we're assuming that we get called for the standby doctor day, which means that we're working another 10 hours. And then we have a final day, which is an S day. That's basically when you're soiriste. And this is the case in many hospitals in Switzerland, where essentially you come in the afternoon around 3 p.m. and you work until 9 p.m. The idea of this shift work is to take on all the new admissions from the emergency department in the afternoon and in the evening. That way, the colleagues that have been working during the day, they have time to do their day job and do the tasks for the patients that are actually hospitalized rather than taking on all the new patients, because then that's just too much work. S stands for soiriste, because you're doing the soir, the evening/night. And that typically, we said, is 3 p.m. to 9 p.m., which is 6 hours. That takes us to a grand total of 48 hours. Now, that is a very realistic typical week of shift work. And as you can see, it's not exactly 50 hours, but they typically balance out over the month. So you will roughly do 50 hours a week. The rule is you can't do over 50 hours. That does happen sometimes, but it's not supposed to happen. And let's say if you hadn't been called on the P day, then you would have had a 38-hour week. And that is also possible. You don't always get called when you're on standby. But this is a typical example of what a medical ward week would look like on shift work. The other classic would have been 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. 5 days a week, but that's a pretty obvious one. Let's talk about a typical week in the emergency department. Okay, so here it's shift work all the time. The difference between the medical ward and the emergency department typically is the duration of your shift, and it will vary depending on the hospital you work at. But at mine, most of the time we do 12-hour shifts with some 10-hour shifts, which are slightly more exceptional. So a typical week in the emergency department, let's say we do night shifts as well. So let's say first night, second night, third night, fourth night, and then off. So first night shift, typically you'll work from 7:30 p.m. to 7:30 a.m. And that's 12 hours. Your shift work will vary. So usually you either start a bit later or a bit earlier depending on the night. So the next night, realistically, you're going to start at 10 p.m., finish at 7:30 a.m. Okay, so that gives you 9.5 hours. Your next shift, you're also doing 7:30 p.m. and you finish at 6 a.m. So that gives us 10.5 hours. Actually, it makes more sense to put 5. And we've got our fourth night shift. This is a bit of a brutal week. Fourth night shift, and this time you do again 7:30 p.m. to 6 a.m. and you've got 10.5 hours. So far we've got 43.5 hours that we've worked. Then we have 2 off days, which are well deserved. And then if you've worked 43.5 hours, they can give you another mini shift, which would be 6 hours, kind of like the one we saw in medicine. This can happen if you need to sort of fill in gaps. Otherwise, you'll have the equivalent of a piqué, which means you're on standby, and you can end up doing 6 hours. The other possibility would just be having another day off, which is totally realistic because you've done 4 night shifts. And that brings us to a grand total of 43.5 hours. So again, as you can see, we don't always reach the 50-hour mark, but I've been quite generous here. We could have easily made this a work day, and you can sometimes go slightly over. This is what you can expect working as a doctor in Switzerland in the medical department and in the emergency department. There are 3 points that I think are important to mention. Not every job or residency training program in Switzerland has shift work. You don't necessarily have to do nights. You don't necessarily have to do weekends. I guess it just depends on what you're looking for in a specialty training program and what you're interested in. So for example, when I was on my endocrinology rotation, I had pretty much no weekends, no night shifts, and that was for a good 6 months. If that's really important to you and you don't want to sacrifice that, there are definitely options for you. It just means that you'll be more limited in the training programs that you can find. The other important point to mention is, yes, 50 hours is a lot of time, but I'm talking about the residency training program. If you know a little about the US training program, it's a lot more brutal. And yes, it can be shorter in the number of years, but in terms of hours that are being worked every week by residents, it's pretty rough. That's not to say it's easy in Switzerland. 50 hours is a lot. However, once you've finished your residency training program, most attendings work part-time. I'd say the majority in my hospital, they worked full-time during residency and then they switched to 80%, even 60%, which makes the work-life balance a lot more manageable. If you're planning on moving to Switzerland, don't think it's going to be 50 hours forever. It's not. It's a transition period. It's a couple of years. There's always options to work part-time in the residency training program. It's not as commonplace as in the UK, for example, where I feel like it's almost encouraged in certain specialties, but it is possible. And I know a couple of colleagues personally who are doing their internal medicine residency at 50%. The final point I wanted to mention, yes, it was about overtime. So we talked a lot about the different reasons why you would have to do overtime in Switzerland, especially in the beginning. And you might be wondering, what happens to that overtime? Does it get counted? Do you get paid for it? The answer is yes. As a resident, you badge in and out. So in the morning and in the evening when you finish. So the hospital keeps track of your working hours, and anything that you do over time, you get paid for. And it's a pretty automatic system. So thankfully, you don't need to fill in extra forms and do extra admin for this. Because I've had that experience in the past, and a lot of people just end up giving up because it's just extra work. And if they're finishing late, they already don't have enough time to spare to do extra admin. So yes, you do get paid for your extra work, and it's the same rate as your normal working day hours. The only thing you don't get paid for is your lunch break. So whether you take your lunch break or not, they automatically remove 30 minutes from your day of work, which basically means you can't accumulate those 30 minutes and get paid for them. So you might as well go take a break. Sometimes it's difficult to do that because in a lot of hospitals, you end up keeping your phone with you and you might get called during your break. So it's not really a proper break. But the point is, you don't get paid for your break, so take it. I would say from personal experience, the general vibe is that they try to encourage residents to finish early. There isn't this culture of you want to prove yourself and to show that you're ready for the next step or the promotion, that you're the one that's going to stay the latest. I've thankfully not seen that culture in Switzerland, and quite the opposite. Your attendings and supervisors tend to try and see how they can help you manage your time better, make you finish on time. As you can see, doctors in Switzerland, compared to the UK, they do work long hours. That is slowly changing, and in many hospitals, the plan in the next couple of years is to reduce the baseline hours, something that matches the UK a bit more, which is around 47 to 45 hours. The good news is, while overtime is sometimes necessary, it's not celebrated, and we get paid for those extra hours. Doctors in Switzerland work hard, but they have a great quality of life. Off time is off time. And most doctors I know will take that time to do some sort of physical activity outside in nature, which honestly is one of the biggest perks of living in Switzerland. So what do you think? Is life as a doctor in Switzerland really worth the hype? Let me know in the comments down below. Have a wonderful day, and I will see you in the next video. Bye.